A film I often like to return to every now and again is from the early 50s, a film with Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn. I think there are a few of you here who actually still remember who they were. A movie called The African Queen, a delightful little comedy about a spinster, very religious spinsterish woman, and a very rough and tough and often vulgar boat captain going down a river in Africa. Two people couldn't be as different as these two. And among the cargo in the small boat that is transporting Rosie, the spinster woman, down the river, is cartons and cases of liquor. And Charlie Allnut, played by Humphrey Bogart, is a notorious drunkard. He loses himself in the bottle. And after one evening in which he had had just a little too much to drink and his words were less than polite and kind and gentlemanly to the very religious and proper Rosie, he falls asleep in a drunken stupor, only to wake up the next morning with a terrible hangover. But the hangover was nothing compared to what he saw with his own eyes. He woke up to seeing Rosie pouring the last of the liquor overboard. Not just the bottles, but she'd opened every bottle and was pouring the last of it out before dropping the bottle. And he says, "Oh, miss, have a heart, have mercy. I can't help myself. It's just my nature." To which she says in one of the most immortal lines only given by Katharine Hepburn, "Nature, Mr. Allnut, is what we are put in this world to rise above." Now, we might see in that an illustration of what Jesus is saying in the last part of today's gospel. If your hand is your undoing, cut it off. If your foot is your undoing, cut it off. If the liquor is your undoing, pour it out. If the internet is your undoing, shut it down. That which leads us to sin should be taken away from our lives. And it seems much more practical with such inanimate objects as, say, liquor or the computer or the internet. But when it comes to cutting off our own members, what are we to make of that teaching of Jesus? Well, we know Jesus is not asking us to maim ourselves, but he knows the extremes to which we will go to explaining away our sinfulness or our bad habits or our shortcomings, to excuse them either in ourselves and someone else. And so, seeing the extreme measures and extreme excuses we will make, he responds in kind with other extreme responses. If it's that hard to control your hand, then just cut it off. Hopefully we respond with a shock. Of course we're not going to cut it off. And so the logical response for Jesus would be, then learn to control it. Perhaps some of the excuses we often hear nowadays is, well, that's just the way I am. That's just what I'm used to doing. That's my nature. We hear a lot these days of, that's how God made me, and I need to be true to who I am, forgetting that Jesus commanded us not to be true to who we are, but to die to ourselves. But one of my all-time favorites is, well, they're only human. It just shows that I'm human. And when you really ponder that, just imagine what an insult that one comment would be to God. We're only human. We have a dignity above every other creature on earth, every other creature ever created, in that we are made in the image and likeness of God. And we are reducing it to an only. Just last week in my Psalms class, we talked about creation and how God ordered creation. Nature follows the order, follows the law, which science seeks to uncover, the laws God put in creation. But then for us, who are made in his image and likeness, he gave his law, the Torah, that caps all of creation. And in violating the law of God that he has given us as people made in his image and likeness, we are in fact doing damage to creation itself. One might call it the ultimate green laws are the 10 Commandments. We're violating how we have been created when we disobey the laws God gave us as a guidebook to how we are to live as beings made in God's image and likeness. So just imagine how offensive that one line must be to God as an excuse for our sinfulness or our shortcomings. Well, we're only human. We're not only human, we are human. And how important is, what is Jesus communicating, is how important it is to avoid sin. To avoid sin. the extreme measures we must take, starting with a deep self-awareness, to constantly look to overcoming sin, not to constantly second-guess ourselves, but to constantly know where our temptations lie, where our shortcomings lie, where our tendency is to sin, and to work to overcome it. And when we fail, and we know we will, but I don't say that as an excuse, we have the sacrament of confession in which we come before God to seek His forgiveness. This is how important it is. And while as human beings we may take extreme measures to explain away our sinfulness, and Jesus takes, therefore, extreme metaphors and descriptions to emphasize how important it is, perhaps nothing is more extreme than what He says midway through today's gospel, when He says, especially, not only if one sins, but if one teaches these little ones to sin, it is better if they be thrown into the sea with a great millstone tied around their neck. Now, I'm not thinking in terms of a mafia film in which they put someone's feet in concrete and throw them into the ocean. But again, let me return to the creation stories that we hear in the Scriptures, which no doubt Jesus is building upon. We in the space age, when we think of the state of creation prior to God saying, "Let there be light," most of us might tend to think prior to creation, everything was a vacuum, the vacuum of space, this emptiness, this empty void with no lights, no gravity, no feeling, no nothing. But at the time of the writers of the Scriptures, the time of the ancients who didn't have rockets or planes to go up and see that the sky is blue, not because it's water, but because of the atmosphere, but they believed we were surrounded by water. The rain came down, the mountains pierced the skies, and the rivers came down. But prior to creation, as we read in the book of Genesis, it said the earth was a formless wasteland. Darkness covered the abyss, which is the bottomless ocean, and a mighty wind swept over the water. Two things existed before God said, "Let there be light." Darkness and the abyss, a realm of death, the darkness of the sea, which is uninhabitable without assistance by human beings. So given that, what is Jesus really describing when He says, "It would be better if you be cast into the sea with a great millstone around your neck"? Think the Titanic, 2 miles down, utter darkness, a literal vacuum of pressure, and a stone taking you straight down without any displacement, without any delay. There's no treading water. You're going down, down, down to a realm of darkness and death. That is where Jonah prayed his prayer while he was in the belly of the great fish. It was from the depths that he prayed that prayer to God, who he had disobeyed in not going to Nineveh. And that is perhaps the sentiment of the psalmist. If you look at Psalm 130, it begins, "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice." Out of the depths I cry to you. And that's the image that Jesus is giving. Not that He wants us to experience something like that, either physically, literally, or spiritually and metaphorically. He came, after all, to redeem us, to give us life. But this is how important it is to avoid sin. Again, not to the point of obsessive compulsion or paranoia, but to move us away from the human tendency to make excuses, and rather the drive of one born and made in the image and likeness of God, created in the image and likeness of God, to always be oriented toward living more fully that law of God and teaching our children to do so as well. They're familiar metaphors we hear in today's gospel. But how often have we really thought about what it means, what Jesus is asking us to do, and why He's speaking in such extreme measures as He does? Because we are people who even think in extremes when it comes to conversion. We don't like to think we're doing something wrong. We like affirmation. We don't like to be challenged. We like to be affirmed. And Christ affirms us. He does it multiple times throughout the Scriptures. Never tells us we've made it, because He knows that's when we fall into complacency. But He lets us know when we're on the right track and reminds us of what's at stake. So let us truly embrace that as we prepare to receive that Eucharist from the table of the Lord. Let us pray to God that by His grace we will continue all throughout our lives to turn away from sin and be faithful to the gospel. It's an extreme focus that He's calling us to have, But the other extreme is what he offers us in the kingdom of heaven. In the words of St. Dominic Savio, very familiar to many of the young men in our parish, thanks to our good friend Father Tyler, his basic motto was death rather than sin. Much more simple way of putting it than the very eloquent way in which it's communicated by Christ in today's gospel. But as Rosie says in the African Queen, nature is what we are put in this world to rise above. Let us continue to rise above that sinful nature from our fallen humanity and move ourselves more to that redeemed nature that we put on in our baptism, in which we embraced Christ on the cross, in which he gives us that life more abundantly, and orient ourselves to always embracing that law of God that caps his creation and is a complement to us who are called to live it as beings made in God's image and likeness. And let us be those teachers of our children in the ways of faith, in the ways of God's law, in turning away from sin, and more importantly, embracing and be true to the gospel given to us by Jesus Christ.